Hi, everyone. Welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about Introduction to Human Inquiry and introduce a little bit about the topics of research methodology and why we, as scientists and researchers, go down this process of research in general. The key elements to why we do research come down to a number of factors. Society and human behavior is not always easily predictable, and we, as humans, have sort of an innate desire to be able to predict the future. People are very driven by the need to anticipate what is going to happen next or what would occur if something changes. And so that has helped us to navigate the world around us, and therefore research and empirical findings really have a benefit of being able to let us have some certainty about the way that the world works. We like to make predictions based off observations, whether that's knowing what the weather might do, knowing what weather patterns are going to do in terms of predicting fires and natural disasters, whether that's making policy decisions about the economy, knowing what might happen in an upcoming election, knowing what's going to happen with our health as a result of our current situation. Any of those things, as humans with a cognitive function, become very important based on knowing sort of what has happened in the past and wanting to know where we're going to be able to navigate and make sound decisions as a result. And that should resonate with policymakers specifically, folks in public administration, really in industry, any industry, really. We are concerned with being able to know if we do X, we think Y should happen. Um, there's a difference between prediction and understanding. Being able to predict that if X happens, that will cause Y to occur is one thing, right? Sometimes it's very likely that we can know that if something happens, something else might happen. Understanding why that occurs, however, is a very sort of different investigative process and becomes more complicated for social scientists. Society, especially when dealing with like human patterns of behavior, is very difficult. And so even if we are able to predict things, knowing why something changes as a result of something else is even more difficult. Knowing that a government program potentially helps someone in need, but not knowing whether it's one of the many different services that are offered within that program that is the mechanism, and was it whether the information they gained was beneficial, or was it because they were actually committed to participating in the program and they were focusing more hours than they otherwise would, right? Knowing which of those interventions or mechanisms, or if it's a combination of them, actually is the reason for the change, that becomes very useful in terms of also then being able to change those policy levers or impact them further to benefit and impact additional outcomes that matter. So the way cause and effect works, these relationships are probabilistic, meaning like it's not always a one-to-one guarantee like in the physical sciences, right? Gravity works in a specific way. Every time I drop something from my hand, it will fall to the floor in the current state of earthbound gravity. So those type of things are deterministic in the sense where like it's always going to happen. With humans, right? Every morning I get up and I brush my teeth and I shower and I go to work, which is a pretty predictable process, but it's probabilistic in that there's some weekends where I don't work and I don't get up and I don't take a shower, right? Or I'm going to shower later in the day because I'm going to run some errands or whatever. Once first thing when I get up, right? So human behavior is in that way probabilistic, meaning right there's a likely outcome, right? And then there are sort of statistical patterns that occur in terms of being able to say, well, it's very likely or it's highly likely that something occurs, but it's never an absolute certainty with humans, right? The economy can go into massive recessions or crashes, even if everything else, the rest of the time doesn't do that, right? Natural disasters can occur. There's power outages, right? There's a lot of things that, we have a sort of somewhat predictable and stable society as a whole, but there are definitely opportunities for things to occur that are going to impact and change that. So being able to predict what we can, or at least have more certainty about what is true and knowable, can benefit when faced with that type of probabilistic and uncertain type of world that we live in. In the textbook, they talk a little bit about agreement reality, right? And the idea of like, how do we as society and humans know what we know, right? What is considered agreed upon known information, right? We all sort of at some point know that you shouldn't put your hand on something because it's hot. We, whether as a child, burn ourselves or as an adult, burn ourselves, right? There's common experiences. And so the book talks about some different options here that I think are relevant, one of which is the shared cultural knowledge. It's interesting because different societies in different cultures have different common knowledge. And that can actually be very different than the common knowledge that we have as Americans, right? Or as, even just people from Southern California may have a very different cultural reality. For example, right? Like in January, it's totally normal and fine to wake up in the morning and think, I'm going to put on a t-shirt and a pair of shorts and go run some errands because, right, you don't necessarily have to do research to identify like weather patterns in Southern California because like, well, we know that in January, like the coldest it usually gets is right, maybe 60 some odd degrees, maybe in the 50s if it's really early in the morning, right? That's a pretty culturally known thing, right? I don't ever grab an umbrella when I run out because odds are it's probably not raining, right? So these are things that like we know as part of kind of the culture that we have, right? And so that may not be true for someone that lives in Buffalo, New York, right? Or somebody that lives in southern India, right? And so those type of things, right? They're a type of knowledge that we gain and culture develops, right? Whether that's through stories, right? You can think about indigenous peoples in early North America where, right, stories were told and information was passed down through cultural, storytelling and through learning experiences, right? If someone eats a wild plant and gets sick and dies as a result, right? Like, well, there isn't medicine and there isn't science at that time, right? So people tell other people and they learn that that happens. And there's this cultural knowledge to avoid eating said plant, right? This is part kind of shared cultural knowledge. This is also comes from tradition, right? Things like religious history, right? And different culture. We pass down things through tradition. And so generations on generation learn similar things, right? They learn from their parents or they learn from, they either from priests or from their rabbi or from the imams, right? That information is conveyed. And it's not just religious information that is part of tradition, right? There are cultural things, right? In Catholicism outside of what the church teaches, right? There's, cultural habits, right? Sports fans, like somebody's a Bears fan because my dad was a Bears fan and their dad was a Bears fan, right? I'm not because obviously they're not doing so great at the moment that this video is being shot. But I guess that probably holds true many of the seasons for Bears if you're Bears fans, right? But like there are things that you develop and know and don't question or test, right? Because they are passed down through tradition and they are sort of accepted as norms or practices that are just known, right? That is very different from things like scientific and empirical study and investigation, where we have to go out and say, I know that someone in a previous generation told me that was true, right? But I don't necessarily know because if it was passed down, it was passed down, it was passed down, and I wasn't there to know, right? I really want to validate and go out and find out for myself, right? Someone can say, if you put your hand on a hot stove, you're going to get burned. Don't do it. And my grandfather told me that, and his grandfather told me that, and so it's something we just don't do, right? It's at a certain point, it's very easy to say, well, I don't actually know that to be true. I've never put my hand on a hot stove. I just know that's something I should know through tradition, right? But if I go out and I take a hot stove, I put my hand on it and burn myself, I can empirically test, yes, that is still continues to be true, right? And so, right, there's one thing about knowing through tradition, and there's another about knowing through empirical investigative study and scientific process. Um, Authority is a good factor in this too. Sometimes the authority of the person or the source of information makes a big difference, right? People who are scientists, leaders, people who are subject matter experts in a particular field, we place a lot of value on their ability to either provide the information or validate it. So there are things, right? We go to research panels, we go to conferences. Somebody's the leading expert in cancer research in America. What they say about what is happening in cancer research is something that ends up being very important to us. And we trust what they're saying because they've been studying this for almost their entire life, if not longer, right? And that's not something I do on a day-to-day basis, right? So the credibility and the weight of their authority comes through with the knowledge that we have, right? So there's different sources of way that information can be known or can be trusted. The same thing is now true with social media and Facebook and the internet and things with artificial intelligence, right? There's a lot of information that comes out. Some of it's true, some of it's not, right? Being able to know whether there's an authority and a trusted source behind it or not can matter. Who it comes from makes a difference. If they're not a trusted source, is it someone from my family lineage or my tradition or my culture, right? Political arguments these days, right? Like there are conservative and there are liberal conversations and sets of knowledge, right? And what conservatives and liberals talk about and think to be true are different because the information that is shared, right, that shared cultural understanding, how things are shaped, are not the same, right? And that can create a lot of problems and a lot of tensions and a lot of challenges in terms of navigating society, making decisions, and just as a human, right, knowing what to believe and what is true. So being able to understand what is real, how do we know what is real, right? The only true way that we can really say what is real is that there is a scientific assertion that there is a relationship between two things. This is where the scientific method and the process of doing science comes in, and being able to say that there should be both a theory and empirical support, meaning I think that it doesn't rain often in Southern California. That is my theory because I go outside a whole bunch and I don't see it rain, right? And I can provide empirical support by I can go out every day and I can count how many days a year it rains, and I can go to other places that are not Southern California and count how many days they rain, and I can test whether the total number of days of rain here is much less or average or higher than all these other places, right? And I can do that for an extended period of time, and it is observable and it is testable, and that can give me information about the theory and say, yes, it does rain less on average in Southern California. That theory is correct, right? That process of having a theory and a hypothesis saying, right, I don't think it rains that much here compared to other places, right? That's my hypothesis. I go out, collect data, I test it, right? And then I draw a conclusion after I have done so is the scientific method. And that is what research is for. When I say, I think this program that we offer as a government organization causes people to get better jobs or earn more money or live healthier lives and what have you, right? It's good and perfectly fine to feel and think that, right? But that is a feeling or the thought, right? It might be the start and foundation of a theory, because if there's a reason to believe that the services you provide could cause that change, then you should go out, get the empirical evidence to test that theory, and then conclude after the analysis whether it does or does not, right? That is the basis of program evaluation. That is the fundamental focus of what we're going to talk about in this course and how we're going to apply research methods, right? But that approach applies not just to program evaluation, but any type of a thing, right? Just because someone said it on the internet, just because someone thinks it, doesn't necessarily mean it's true until there's evidence or information that might back it up, right? And if there isn't, even if someone said it, right, I should be skeptical of whether or not it is actually correct because there's no evidence to provide support otherwise. There's a field called epistemology, which is the science of knowing. This is sort of the more philosophical approach of people who study how it is we know what we do know, right? Which is more of a meta question, if anything else. It's fundamentally sort of a interesting field, right? But thinking about the ways that we do different types of science and what those decisions mean about how we know what we know and those type of things. It's definitely an interesting topic. We're not going to go into that much here. It is quite complicated and abstract at times, right? But there is a field called epistemology you should be aware of, right? That digs into those topics even deeper at an even greater theoretical level. We are, for the purposes of this course, going to presume and hold true, right, that the scientific method and that process is a functional way for us to know what we know, and put our backing in the fact that that assumption is correct. Epistemology might say that that may not necessarily always be the case, but that is a different class, a different discussion for a different class at a different time. Methodology, right, is more about the science of finding out. It is the systematic process, right? When people say we do science, science does not mean using chemicals and using animals and doing lab tests and things like that. Science is a process of finding out, and the science method, the methodology of science, is that idea of develop a theory, create a hypothesis, collect data, analyze, and conclude at a high level. That is the scientific method. And it can be applied to economics, it can be applied to religion, it can be applied to political science, it can be applied to natural sciences, it can apply to environmental research and marine biology. It doesn't really matter. That is all scientific method, just applied to different fields. For our purposes, we are going to focus on the scientific method as applied to evaluating government and nonprofit programs and services to determine whether they reach desired outcomes. So, this is that process, right? We start with the question. Most of the time in the evaluation space, that question is, does this program or do the services we deliver lead to the outcome that we are interested in having achieved by participants of this program? The hypothesis oftentimes is that, yes, this program does lead to that, which is what we hope is true. And we will only know if it's true after we have done the following three steps, which are A, we need to gather evidence, right? I need to figure out what outcome it is. I need to know who it is that I'm going to be gathering information about, right? I need to go out and say, I'm going to collect data and I'm going to observe and going to ask questions and I'm going to capture what I need to be able to test my hypothesis. That is, this program leads to some outcome, right? In this course, we're going to talk about an article by Chen on the Taiwanese garbage reduction program. Often, that program is designed to say that we are going to change the policy about garbage collection practices. And our hypothesis is that by doing so, people will produce less garbage and that will help bring down the amount of trash that is produced. We don't really know that until we gather evidence and go out and say, I need to actually see how much garbage is being produced on a daily basis by people before we make this policy change, and then change the policy and continue doing that and compare. Because if the amount of garbage stays the same or goes up after we've changed the policy, right, the evidence would say that we are wrong, right? So we gather the evidence. Obviously, once you have the data collected, the evidence that you need to analyze it. This is where statistical methodology comes into play, qualitative data analysis processes, things that are sort of the focus of other classes besides this one that you've either probably already taken or may want to take more of, right? But we take our data, we analyze it, we do the rigorous computations to make sure that we understand the probabilities and the correlation coefficients and all of these things that happen in analysis. And only after all of those things do we conclude, right? If I run my program and I say, the amount of daily garbage production that occurs every day is actually twice as high after we changed this policy for 4 months than it was the 4 months beforehand, right? Empirically, you should conclude that it didn't work, right? And it's okay it didn't work. The fact of the matter is, that doesn't mean you give up trying to solve the problem. It means that you come up with a different strategy and you do something else and test that hypothesis. And that's okay, right? The fact of the matter is, you don't say, well, I think the data is wrong, right? You collected the data, right? Maybe you did something wrong in your analysis and it's fine to want to double check that, right? But at a certain point, overwhelmingly, the evidence says you are incorrect, right? And that you should do something else. In government program delivery, the same is true. If I have policies and I have programs and I have services and I evaluate and I collect data and I analyze it year after year after year, and every time it seems to show that most of the time people who are in my program are not achieving the outcomes of interest, right? If I have a homeless services program and people are not getting housed year after year after year, it doesn't matter if I feel like I'm doing something helpful and I feel good about who I'm helping. Empirically, the evidence is saying that that's not true. So you either need to change the way, and when I say change the way you do your research, I don't mean change the numbers to make it look like there is some outcome being achieved. What I mean is try different measurement strategies, try different research questions, collect data in a different way potentially, right? Not to bias the results in your favor, right? But don't just keep doing the same thing over and over again. See if there's a better way to do your research. But if it's also over and over again telling you the same thing, do something different, right? If every time you go out and you play football, flag football with your friends on the weekend, you come home and your body hurts, right? Like maybe that's your body trying to tell you something. And you could try and you could try and try again, but if the result continues to be the same, maybe you should do something different. Maybe you should wear padding. Maybe you should stop playing that sport, right? Maybe you need to exercise or do something else in advance to prepare yourself better for it, right? That's the conclusion. And it's okay for the data to tell you something that is not what you want to hear, right? But the fact of the matter is, as long as you are taking actions to do something different, to try to change what the evidence is telling you, that is the importance, right? I know a lot of people in government become very concerned about program evaluation, performance management, because they don't want to look bad, right? The data might make me look bad. I want to try to make sure that the data we have shows we're doing good, blah, 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 because budgets and because of politics and because of all these reasons it matters, right? To some degree, that is true, right? But the fact of the matter is, the data tells you what is actually happening. If the data tells you that something is not working, right, you shouldn't be afraid of saying that something's not working. You should be afraid of not doing something differently to try to change the fact that it's not working, right? If you don't want to change anything and the data tells you that something is wrong, that's when there's a problem, right? Don't be mad at what data is or does or says, right? Do data for data's sake so that you can know, right? And then be open to the fact that if it doesn't look like it's saying what you want to see, right? Start thinking about why that is and do something differently. If you don't want to do that, that's when there's a problem, because you don't want to change your behavior and you don't want to do something different than what is required of you as a person to make decisions and improve your programs and the service delivery for your constituents. Errors and error avoidance. Obviously, in the research process, there are certainly things people can do wrong somewhere along the way, right? It is important that we think about what some of these are. There are a few slides here, and we'll talk about a couple of different options, right? So inaccurate observations, obviously, failing to pay close attention to the world around us. The idea that, right, we can lead to mistakes in understanding and interpreting events. Things like early pandemic period. We started to look at early observations about what was happening and the transmission and the spread of that disease. We ended up, not we personally as in me, but we as in like society, delayed our response because we initially underestimated, right? If anybody can think back that far, you can remember that we sort of thought this would be contained to Wuhan and it was maybe a Chinese city problem. And then it sort of maybe potentially was spreading to other people, right, in other parts of China. And then we sort of thought, well, maybe people just need to get out of China, right? We were looking at the wrong information about how respiratory infections spread and how people can transmit to other people because we sort of either didn't want to believe or at least initially didn't have a good full understanding and grasp of how the transmission of this disease was, partly because it was novel, right? We call it novel coronavirus because it was a new version of coronavirus. And by the time that we had sort of come to grips with what we think we should expect, right, it had already deeply impacted the global health system by spreading and extending, right? Which may not be a surprise in retrospect when many other respiratory conditions like the flu and tuberculosis and other things, right, are transmitted very similarly, right, through mucus and air molecules that we emit through breathing and coughing and sneezing. Right, that type of information could help us have prepared differently than, right, the inaccurate observations that we used during the early stages of the pandemic, right? Other things are definitely still true that can also lead to us to make poor decisions in the scientific process or in the empirical decision-making field. Overgeneralization, right? Stereotypes are a problem because people take from a small group and they overgeneralize about a large group, right? Thinking about like the Black Lives Matter movement and things of that nature, where the news media was covering the fact that there were, rioting and looting and violence in the streets, right? And so Black Lives Movement as a whole was problematic because it was mostly this violent uprising. No, that's not really true. That was true in a couple instances in a couple pockets of people that either maybe were or were not even affiliated with the movement as a whole, right? But that coverage led to people drawing conclusions and overgeneralizing about everybody else as a result, right? And so that can be one of the decisions that we make as humans, as part of human nature, that we want to avoid through the use of rigorous scientific methodology so that we don't do that. Replication is another. We oftentimes will do one study or conclude one thing as a result of one investigation and then believe that that's true forever, right? Replication is important because we also want to make sure that, right, just because the program worked, for one group of people at one time in one place, doesn't mean it works for everybody all the time, every other place. Right? We don't know that until you do studies at other times, at other places with other people and continue to get the same results. Um, Selective observations, this idea that, right, I'm going to cherry pick the things, right, that reinforce what I already believe and use that as evidence. And I'm going to ignore information that contradicts me, right? So, for example, we had media coverage during the US withdrawal of Afghanistan highlighted, right, there were people attacking at the airports, right? They were sort of trying to flee the country or they were attacking the military folks. And I can use that information to focus on the fact that this withdrawal was a failure, even though I'm going to ignore tons and tons of other successful evacuation steps and peaceful transitions of powers and other things that happen lots of other places, right? Because that just generally doesn't mesh with what I want to say and believe to be true, right? So I'm going to pick and choose things that reinforce my perspective, right? The border, we talk about illegal immigration on the border and all of the problems it causes today, right? We pick and choose specific instances of, well, this one person did something bad. They came over from the border, right? And therefore, right, we're also overgeneralizing there, right? But we are picking and choosing those few instances when they help our case, right? The idea that like a good guy with a gun stops a bad guy with a gun is great. When I find two examples of that happening and then use that to reinforce my argument, and then just pretend like all of the other scenarios where people who were good guys with guns didn't help the situation and or it still went poorly, we're just going to ignore those, right? Because those don't comport with what I already believe. And so we don't talk about those. Illogical reasoning, right? This is more of the idea that the exception proves the rule to justify policies or conclusions, right? If one thing happens to be true one time, right? And I just decide that that basically is like, well, look, like this one time I gave an employee, we see this a lot with like policies where somebody does something wrong, right? And then we make a whole new policy because like, well, that person did this thing, right? And so all employees, I caught one employee who was teleworking and that employee was actually at their kid's soccer game instead of at their computer doing their work. And so all employees, right, are not working while they're teleworking. We're going to write a new policy, right? This is flawed logic, right? That it's part of an overgeneralization again, right? But it's also sort of like I'm looking at this one exception and thinking that like, well, my belief of the fact that like all employees aren't working while they're teleworking is true because of this example, right? It's the exception. It's not necessarily um, the common situation, right? And so it ends up being an illogical reason behind our justification. So building on all of these ideas, right? Why do we pursue social research in general, right? There are different types of social research, but most of them come back to we need to be able to know things about the way society works. And there are different types of research questions or research focuses, if you want to put it that way, right, in different buckets, right? Exploratory research is to explore a new topic or phenomenon, right? We may not know much about something at all. Coronavirus is a new thing. We've never dealt with it before, right? To be able to deal with that disease at all, we might need to study it and begin to capture information and know what we can know about it because right now we know nothing, right? We are grappling against a pandemic that is a problem, right? And obviously this is many, many years after the pandemic that I'm having this conversation, right? But at the time in 2020, that was true, right? There are new things happening all the time. Artificial intelligence is another one. It's new, it's great, it's fancy, right? How's it going to impact us and what is it going to do in terms of technology and security and all these things? Don't know, right? It's new. It's not really new technically if you want to get into the semantics of artificial intelligence, but like its widespread proliferation is a new occurrence in society. We need to learn more about it. Therefore, we pursue exploratory research to understand what it does, how it works, how it impacts children's mentality, how it impacts cognitive development, how it impacts political decision making or beliefs. Right? Like we don't know anything about those questions right now because we're just only getting into this field of study. Descriptive research is another area. This is probably the most common thing you see data people do in government or in the world of just day-to-day, business and governmental operations, right? I need to provide a detailed account of the situation, what happened, what is going on. Tell me who, what, where, when, why. Not so much why, right? But tell me who, what, where, and when, right? How many services did we deliver? To whom, right? There's a fire in LA County right now that we need to respond to. Tell me where it is. How many people have been evacuated? What is the demographic composition of that group, right? Those are descriptive questions because if I need to know anything, at a minimum, if I know nothing, I need to know sort of a description of what is going on, right? I am not firsthand available in the fires. I am not the one responding to this dengue fever situation that we are dealing with. I need to know how many people have it, who has it, where are those people, right? Give me that description about what is going on. In government service delivery, I need to know how many clients we have, what services are being delivered, how many people are delivering how much services, right? Those type of things are what we'll talk about in terms of performance measurement and service delivery and outputs, right? The idea of being able to know who are we helping, who's getting how many services, and when are they getting those services and where, that is descriptive research. Explanatory research is much harder. Obviously, as we've already said in social sciences, it's very difficult to be able to say why things actually cause other things to occur. And that requires more in-depth, rigorous research. This is typically the vein of research and think tank groups, as well as academic researchers at universities, to be able to actually explain causes and reasons behind phenomena, why people vote the way they do, and the reasons that they make those decisions is something that requires doing research, talking to those people, collecting data and analyzing it, and investigating sociological, economic, political factors, right? Why those relationships exist in society and being able to identify the underlying mechanisms that require, sometimes we don't always know. Sometimes we think we know, and then we do another piece of research and they contradict each other. Why? Well, because why I choose to exercise when I'm 22 because I want to look good and be fit because I'm trying to find a partner, right, is very different than when I'm 42 and I want to not die of a heart attack, right, and I'm happily married, but I also don't really want to be in pain and immobile and things as I get older, right? And so the reasons why we do the same thing at different points may change, right? Why people do things one time but they don't do it others may, right, have different reasons. And so humans are complicated, society's complicated, right? And to be able to understand those uniqueness and nuances, we need to do explanatory research. So in the foundations of social science, right, when we start to do these type of research of any kind, we have to take the concepts of the way the world works and we have to generalize them into things like concepts and variables, right? Variables tend to be things like logical grouping of related attributes, right? So, for example, well, some people have lived a long time, some people have lived a less amount of time, right? We need a name for that idea and that concept, right? So we have the idea of a variable called age, and age tells us relative to other people, how much or less are you in terms of years lived, right? It doesn't necessarily always have to be years lived, right? But that is a variable that we create to logically group people by how many years it's been since they were born, right? The attributes for that could be a number of things, right? We might express it as the number of years old you are, right? I am 39, you are 22, you are 77. That's one way, right? Oftentimes we group things into buckets and we might say you are a young person, meaning you're between 0 and 17 years old. You are middle age, so you might be between 18 and 64. And old might be senior, so you're 65 and above because that is Medicare, Social Security eligible. Right? We might also do something different, right? We might be working age and say you're 18 to 54, right? You might be senior working age, so you're 55 to 64, right? There's different groupings. But the fact of the matter is, we group these attributes into characteristics or qualities, right? We use male or female to describe your sex. We use African American, Asian American, Caucasian, or white to group your attributes for the race or ethnicity variable, right? We might identify you as Democrat or Republican or liberal or conservative to group your political views, right? We have variables, and the reason is because to do structured and systematic analysis of things like large groups of people and their behavior, right? If everybody is unique in their attributes, there's really no patterns that we can detect, right? Because there are, if I do a study of 3,000 people and every one of them is a little bit different from everybody else and I don't group them, right? I can't look for patterns across 3,000 unique individual people. I need to look at the difference between 1,400 males and 1,600 females. And so by grouping them, I can then compare and contrast the differences, right? So to be able to do mathematical statistical analysis, we are dependent on trends in the population, and trends are easier to identify when we group people, right? That also inherently comes with a trade-off, which means that we have to inevitably address the fact that there are oversimplifications, and some of these, right, things that we've talked about that can be a concern are also relevant here because, right, well, gender identity is an interesting one. Like, well, how do I group people for their gender identity attributes? Well, ideally, right, the best solution for letting people identify their gender identity from a social sensitivity perspective is to say, well, tell me what your gender identity is and describe it however you want. But if I get 3,000 different answers and you want me to explain to you the differences in political opposition to Trump administration policies as a result of gender identity, well, I might have to look at 3,000 individual characteristics and responses because everybody gave me a different answer, as opposed to being able to say, well, if I can group people into non-binary or masculine or feminine at least, right, I then now have three big buckets that I can use to compare and contrast differences to see, right, as opposed to not being able to do anything at all because I don't have sort of common groupings of attributes that I can use to look for patterns for. Patterns are dependent on multiple instances of observation. And if I don't have those patterns, I'm not going to be able to do anything. So in social research, right, these social concepts matter, and we need to be able to use variables and attributes to group these related things into categories and their associated values. An example of this, right, in a basic test, I might be interested in whether educated people are less prejudiced than uneducated people, right? That might make a difference in terms of how society works, what we might expect out of different responses to different types of governmental policies, things like that, right? So I might come up with variable one. I need to say, well, I need to define someone as educated or uneducated, right? My attributes are you're either educated or uneducated. We might also be able to vary different levels of education, right? But I might just, for the sake of simplicity, say bachelor's degree or higher attained means that you are educated, and if you have a high school diploma or equivalent or less, you are uneducated, right? So those are my two different categories, right? I also then want to understand whether someone is prejudiced or unprejudiced. Well, that's a lot more complicated, right? But I could potentially devise a questionnaire where I ask a number of questions, and there is a potentially more or less prejudiced response, right? If I ask true or false, do you believe that most Black members of society commit crimes on a regular basis, right? If somebody says yes to that question, we might be able to easily say, that sounds like a pretty prejudiced answer, right? If somebody says, no, I don't believe that, right? I can group them. That is a drastic oversimplification of how this might work, right? Right. But like there are ways that we could dig further into a better application of that type of a concept and say, right, do you think Muslim countries predominantly produce terrorists, right? If you say yes, or you say, well, I somewhat agree that that's true, right? You might be more prejudiced than someone who says that, no, I don't believe that at all, right? And so we could build a system to say, if you score more than 20 points you know, um, out of 40 on this questionnaire survey that we've created, you are prejudiced. If you score less than 20, you're not prejudiced, right? Something like that as an example, we can then say, okay, well, what's the difference between the people who said they were educated or are educated based off their degree attainment and their prejudice scores, right? In example A, here on the upper right corner, you can see that there is what we believe to be a bit of a pattern, right? The number of uneducated people who are not prejudiced is very small, just one individual person standing there, right? In the category of people who are educated on prejudice, we have seven, right? We see a fewer number of people who are educated and prejudiced. It's not wholly impossible that educated people are not prejudiced, right? So there's definitely a few there, but obviously not as many as in the uneducated, unprejudiced, right? The number of uneducated and prejudiced people is also much higher, right? So in society, this tends to be how things work because there are not perfect correlations. It's not going to be 50%, 50% in the two obvious buckets and zero in the rest, right? Not humans don't work in such a way that that's always going to necessarily be how it shakes out, right? But we definitely see a bigger amount of people in the upper right and the lower left sections of A than we do in the upper left and lower right hand section of A, right? When we don't have a relationship where there is no correlation or relationship between whether you're educated or not, and if you are or are not prejudiced, we get something that looks like B, which is in any one of these quadrants, we have an equal distribution of people, right? And then in the prejudice section, we have, right, four men in each group. We have two women in each group. In the bottom category, we have one or two women and two or three men, right? There is no obvious distribution of people where they're all up in these two corners and almost nobody else in the other, right? That is the type of relationship we see when we don't have correlations or causal relationships between factors that we are investigating in research, right? So in A, we see statistical patterns. They are never perfect because people are complicated, society is perfect, right? But when we start to take data in aggregate and analyze trends and patterns, we start to see differences between groups on a large enough margin of difference from what we would expect, which is what we see in B, so that when we see something like A, we start to think there's a relationship here, right? And we can start to conclude that there may be in this scenario a relationship between how educated you are and whether or not you're a prejudiced person, right? Multivariable equations become more deep in investigatory analysis of issues where, right, who you choose to vote for president may not just be because you're educated or uneducated, it may be because of a number of factors, right? So we have different things called independent variables. Independent variables are those that might be on the left side of the image you see on the right, where a variable is presumed to cause or influence the dependent variable, right? I strongly believe that what your political party identity is will determine who you're going to vote for as president, right? That is independent. You don't, right? No one's telling you necessarily which political party to affiliate with, right? Like you have your own natural and intrinsic identity that determines which political party you are. independently based off of what that is. I believe that will then determine your choice of presidential candidate, right? Dependent variables are the thing that we believe to be impacted by the others, right? So in this case, it's a variable influenced or determined by an independent variable. I think your choice of president is going to be impacted as a result of which party you are, right? I think you voted for Donald Trump if you happen to be a Republican. I think you voted for Kamala Harris if you happen to be a Democrat, right? Who you voted for is dependent on the independent factor of your political party. Control variables are another idea that come into play when we think about multivariable equations. And when we talk about statistics and regression here in a couple of weeks, you will see where these come into play. We're talking about things that are added to an equation that has multiple variables so that we can hold them constant. And the reason that we do that is so that I can look at the relationship between my independent variable of interest, my dependent variable of interest, without having the patterns that are observed impacted by the other things, right? So somebody could say, well, political party might matter, right? But if you're affluent, you're more likely to vote Republican. And if you're low income, you're more likely to vote Democrat. And that matters maybe the same or more to whether you're Democrat or conservative. Well, if I add that to a regression equation, which we'll talk about, and I say, well, if I collect data from a bunch of people and I ask you who your political party is, and I ask you your annual income level, and then I put both of those into my analysis, if I find a relationship between political party and who you vote for with annual income as a control variable, it means that I have removed annual income as a factor when looking at the relationship between political party and vote choice, right? My relationship between political party and your vote choice continues to be true even when considering annual income as a factor, right? So that is why it becomes a control variable, and that's why we add those things in. So in program evaluation, we'll see examples where, right, I believe strongly that my program leads to people being healthier individuals. It's a nutrition and well-being and fitness program. If they come and participate in this program, then we should see them be healthier people, right? And I think our program leads to that change, but I need to use some control variables because other things also lead to people being healthier or unhealthier that I do or do not have the ability to control, like how busy they are, right? If they have a job and they're taking 20 units of classes and they have children, right, and they're a single parent, right? Like the amount of free time they have available is going to impact their ability to exercise and eat well and other things, right? If they are more or less affluent, right? It's much easier to buy healthier foods and eat better, right? When you have more money to buy produce and fresh vegetables and healthy meats and non-packaged foods, right? That will matter regardless of whether my program assists you or not, right? I might want to include income and life characteristics in as control variables to my equation so that if I say, well, I've controlled for someone's income and I've controlled for whether they're a single parent or a working student or a single parent or have children or not, right? And I still find that my program leads to the outcome of interest. It means that in spite of those other things being a factor for people, right, the relationship between our program and the outcome of interest is still true, meaning, right, well, if somebody is low income, that will impact potentially their outcome. But even in that scenario, our program is still leading to a positive outcome, right? And that matters a lot when we're trying to explain how and why relationships occur and to be able to say, right, well, it's my program that makes a difference and it's not the world of other things that are actually a factor here, right? Those other things may be a factor, right? But in spite of them being a factor as control variables, our program also still has some influence or impact. And that is very important to know if you're trying to justify the existence of a program. So boiling it down to its simple relationship, we in program evaluation in this class are going to focus on fundamentals of program evaluation and the relationship between a couple of things, right? That at its essence boils down to some program delivering services or an intervention of some kind, right, that intend to either increase or improve some outcome, or they tend to decrease or reduce some outcome. I want to reduce recidivism and lower the amount of time off the time or frequency at which people who are previously incarcerated end up reincarcerated. I want to improve the monthly income earnings from employment of people who have been struggling to find work, right? I want to reduce the housing instability of people who have been chronically unhoused as a result of the services we provide. Right? Those type of relationships are the fundamental crux of the research question, the hypothesis of program evaluation and our focus on whether our programs lead to some outcomes, right, at its essence. So, in a public health program, we're implementing a new community-based diabetes program focused on nutrition, exercise, and blood glucose monitoring. Our goal of the services we're delivering is to decrease or reduce the average blood glucose levels amongst diabetic patients that participate in our program, or A1C levels. Right? That relationship is, right, our hypothesis is our program will reduce those A1C levels, right? That is our hypothesis. Theoretically, we're delivering services that should help people better manage their diabetes and better eat better and exercise more, right? And therefore, theoretically, that should be the relationship we see. And then I turn my focus on research methods and applied program evaluation to say, well, let me collect information about glucose levels from our participants and their participation in the program and other control variables that may impact their A1C levels so that I can analyze that data and conclude that our program does or does not have an impact. So that is the ultimate goal of the human inquiry and scientific process, how we apply scientific methodology to these questions about how the world works, how programs work, whether there are relationships between societal factors and other factors. And that is the focus as researchers of producing knowledge and the scientific process. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this throughout the course, right? As we focus on, now that I have a concept and an understanding of why we do this and the purpose of this, the question is, well, then how do I actually build and design an evaluation? And how do I use the scientific method and the tools to actually build a process to create a hypothesis and a research question, collect the data that I need, analyze it, and report on it for whatever my research question of interest happens to be.